This is going to be my Handcannonier's sallet. So it's essentially a mid to late 15th century skull cap with a little bit of neck protection there as well. Now I didn't want to go for a kettle helmet because I had spoken to some Handcannoniers at the Barnet and the Tewkesbury reenactment festivals in June and July in the UK this year. They had all advised basically that the kettle helmet, that kind of the steel brim, it really does amplify and hold in the sound, and it does deafen them quite badly. So I'm only 26, I don't really want to lose my hearing just yet, so I decided to go for the very close-fitting sallet instead. Again, essentially a skull cap. I'm going for no visor, instead I'm going for a extra brow ridge as well, which I may even brass as well to make it look, quite fancy. What we're also going to do here is we're going to add 2 rondels either side of the ears as well for some additional protection. Again, with this kit, I'm probably not going to see much melee combat, but I'd like some additional defense if I can, so a bit of extra protection there I think would look very good. Right then, so without further ado, let's make it.
During the mid to late 15th century, the most common helmet in medieval Europe was the sallet, or sallet. This is essentially a close-fitting skull cap with some additional neck protection. It was a strong, lightweight design which meant it was very durable for combat, and therefore we see it feature very often in contemporary artwork. One thing I find particularly interesting about the sallet is how many different forms and variations there are. You can begin with just a simple skull cap with a short tail, extend the tail, add a reinforced brow plate, add a visor, perhaps a visor and integrated brow plate. Maybe you'd want an articulated tail for extra neck movement, or perhaps a beather for increased throat protection. Circular discs called rondels were also commonplace and came in a variety of sizes. Rondels most commonly feature on sallets, and we see them added in many different ways. Handcannoniers of this period clearly favoured the sallet as well, and also used multiple different configurations. Personally, I've opted for a visorless helmet with a reinforced brow plate, rondels on either side of the temples, and a short tail tucked into the neck. The contemporary artwork also shows us that these gunners were covered head to toe in full plate armour, consisting of a leg harness, cuirass, arm harness, sallet, and even gauntlets. I look forward to making my own pair of gauntlets when recreating this harness, as I do wonder how a soldier would retrieve the ammunition from his pouches, load the charge, and generally handle the cannon, all while wearing mitten gauntlets. So of course there's only one way to find out. Experimental archaeologists and reenactors tell me that typical hand cannons from the 1470s were only accurate up to 20 feet, so this would explain why a gunner would have to be fully armed as he went into battle, as a cavalryman could bridge that 20-foot gap in a matter of seconds. We understand that gunners were often mercenaries and were paid a lot of money to be hired for battles and sieges, far more than a longbowman of the same period. The first explanation is that firearms were still in an experimental stage during this time, and despite the fact that black powder and explosives were being used for over 120 years in Europe by this point, the relatively new technology was still very expensive, so only a small wealthy portion of mercenaries would invest into such weapons and offer their services. The second reason would be that handcannoniers were often expected to travel far and wide as mercenaries, again most likely because they were much less common than their longbowman counterpart, so finding a local retinue of handcannoniers were very rare in comparison, and their expertise were clearly needed. For example, we know that English gunners in the mid-15th century were hired to assist in various German provinces, so we understand that being a gunner in the 1400s would open up many opportunities for deployment overseas. Such mobilisation would surely demand a heavy premium. The third reason could be that, as previously stated, typical guns of this period were only accurate up to 20 feet, which tells us that gunners may have been expensive to hire, as they would also be expected to take part in melee combat as well. After all, an unarmoured gunner would not be able to fire 20 foot away at a charging retinue of cavalry, then be expected to outrun the horses. Handcannoniers were probably expected to stand their ground and fight, hence why they were generally fully armoured soldiers, and, due to their high cost, they would happily invest in decent armour to protect themselves, and we have receipts of soldiers getting paid more depending on whether you were fully armed and therefore better protected for combat. The difference we may see between a fully armoured handgunner and a fully armoured knight, for example, would be that the knight would generally have their armour made with the idea of showing off status in mind. Depending on the individual's budget, they would typically spend a lot of money into getting every part of their harness expertly detailed to show their elevated status on the battlefield amongst their fellow noblemen. For a handgunner, status wouldn't generally be something they cared about, as these were well-seasoned soldiers hired for deployment and deployment only. As such, they would generally go for a more utilitarian range of armour, built to aid the wearer in battle as a priority, made comfortable, lightweight and easy to wear when they were typically donning their harness when marching on campaign, and usually wouldn't be able to rely on having servants to put on or take off their armour for them. Just like in the modern day, you'd invest in a particularly fancy suit when going on an interview, these mercenaries would perhaps invest in some rather gaudy additions to their harness to elevate them above the rest when looking to be hired. To show this off, I have chosen to add some brassed elements to my helmet and to the rest of my harness when it's made, in order to give the impression that I'm a well-seasoned soldier who has clearly been hired for my services multiple times and I've invested some of that money back into looking good, looking professional, yet keeping my armour fully utilitarian and battle ready. When I did deployment training in the British Army, the kit I packed in my Bergen bag the second time was very different to what I took with me on my first exercise, as I learnt the value of bringing the correct kit and how it would make your situation much easier while out on campaign. Of course I never went on campaign, but that's what the deployment training was for. I believe that armoured gunners wouldn't mess around with unnecessary components like big pauldrons or heavy, more protective helmets for the same reason. They would learn the minimum requirements for their kit to keep them safe on the battlefield and keep things lightweight and efficient. And so we now approach the result of my helmet construction. A fitted skullcap made from 2mm mild steel with a short tail, complete with a brassed plume holder, blood red chin straps and brass buckle. 1.6mm mild steel rondels to protect the temples and to prevent serious injury from percussive strikes to the head. The reinforced brow plate is also made from 1.6mm mild steel and has a scallop style on the top, finished with a brass brushing to make it look higher status, perhaps that of a sergeant. The helmet features an internal padded liner made from wool and linen, of which I have crudely cut out the areas where the ears sit, since if the helmet was sitting uncomfortably on the ears due to the internal liner, the soldier would just rip this out or cut it down to make it work while out on campaign, not necessarily caring what it looks like since comfort is a priority and no one will see the interior of the helmet anyway. The helmet has a satin polished finish, since a high polish would require a lot of maintenance to keep it looking shiny and a gunner would not necessarily care about this during deployment. The constant interaction with black powder would most likely ruin the finish pretty quickly during combat anyway, so they would most likely only polish it up and make it look good when getting hired again. No visor as visibility is a priority. I may wear this in configuration with a beather or a male standard for additional throat protection later on. Lastly, I would like to give a big thank you to Lancaster Armoury based in Mansfield for letting me use their workshop to make my gunner's helmet, and I look forward to the next episode where I shall be making another component of my 15th century cannonier's armour. I've left a link in the description below to the Lancaster Armoury website where you can purchase high quality handmade medieval arms and armour. Until then, thanks for watching.